Hello, my name is Phil, and welcome back to the Antioch Report. In today's video, I'm working on the next additions to my Cult of the Black Grail warband with these Grail Hounds. Let's get into it. Using Nomad Sculpt, I had created some trench warfare bases to match the aesthetic of the rest of the warband. I created the look of one of them to be about to go into a trench, hence the sandbags and the corrugated steel, and the other one to have a discarded oil drum which made for some interesting looks. After a prime of Army Painter Matte Black Primer, I started off with a thinned 50-50 mix of Vallejo Model Colour Deck Tan and Vallejo Airbrush Thinner through my airbrush at 25 psi to give the flesh its starting point. Pre-shading when it comes to flesh is just as important for me as the final highlight, and for me I like the undead or mutated flesh to have a bruised look to it. To achieve this, I use Liquitex Muted Violet Acrylic Ink, thinned with Airbrush Thinner 50-50, again through the airbrush at 25 psi. The purple will come through heavier in the shadows, but subtly all over, and give the final look a deeper, more bruised look that I am after. I start to apply the first layer of highlights, which for this instance I wanted to give the skin tone a little bit more of an oxygen-starved look to it. For this, I used a 50-50 mix of Deck Tan and Vallejo Game Air Wolf Grey, then 50-50 with thinner again at 25 psi over most of the raised areas and the upper flat areas. The slight blue tint works well with the purple undertones to get the overall look that I want. Using a 75-25 paint to thinner mix of Still Contrast Berserker Bloodshade, I carefully added the first filter layer to the descended sacks. Wanting to create an interior organ but on the exterior look to them, the Bloodshade allowed me to get some crimson into the mix to build them up from. The final airbrush pass of highlights was a thin 50-50 paint to thinner mix, 50-50 Wolf Grey and Vallejo Game Colour Elfic Flesh. This pass allowed me to complete the dark to light transition of flesh and continuing the blue tint without overwhelming the natural skin tone that I was after. I never shy away from talking about mistakes or things I'm not happy with as a painter, and these videos will be no exception to that. It took me a while to nail the look I was after, and here I was thinking about having the same jaundiced looking patches as I had done with the heralds, but the tones I was going for on the skin were different and they ended up not working out, so later on I ended up going over them. For this step I used Scale 75 Ink Tense Yellow, thin 50-50 with water, applied to some of the flat areas for an intended pop of colour and depth. I was hoping the unifying wash would bring the yellow patches down and blend them in, but unfortunately it didn't. However, the 75-25 mix of Inlay inks carrying crimson and then wash to white spirit mix did do the intended job on the rest of the paintwork, bringing those varying flesh tones closer together for a more unified look and adding a fresher, bloodier look to the oxygen-starved bruised flesh that I was after. With the carrying crimson dried, the next step was to dirty up the flesh a bit. Fitting in with the grimdark themes of Trench Crusade and the looks of both the Plague Knight and the Heralds, I used Villainy Ink's Decrepit Filth Enamel Wash, thinned 50-50 enamel to white spirits to add some brown tones, with the particulates to sit in the recesses to build up the grime without being too over the top. After the enamels, I went back over some of the areas which needed touching up, with 50-50 paint and 50-50 paint to water mix, Wolf Grey and Vallejo Game Air Pale Flesh. I used this just to bring back some of the highlights and to not let the unifying washes tone down the overall look too much. Onto the saws, cuts and descended sacks, I used Citadel Technical Blood for the Blood God in all the nooks and crannies, as well as a general coat over the sacks to really emphasise that torn flesh look that doesn't just heal, but gets reopened time and time again as the Hounds make their way across no man's land and into the enemy trenches. It was at this point I decided the yellow really wasn't working as intended, and that the unifying washes didn't cover or blend them as much as well. So with a thin 50-50 mix of paint to water, I used a 75-25 mix of Elfic Flesh and Vallejo Game Colour Dead Flesh to blend those spots back into the general overall flesh tone. I left some areas intentionally, as once blending had begun, I could see where they were properly blended in and looked okay, as yes, I wanted to cover my mistakes, but I also knew that when something does work and those small spots really did add a bit of depth, so I left them alone. I also used some thin 75-25 white spirit to enamel Villainy Ink's Decay of Death over the models to add a slightly sickly green tone, It's very subtle off camera and you can't really see it on camera, but it is there and works well, although the footage of me applying it got corrupted sadly. The curse of overpainting is certainly real. Anytime you go back over a model with just one more layer can be too much, and that is something I strive not to do as to ruin the work I put in. So with that said, I used some Sistel Wash, Caribou Crimson, Blood for the Blood God, as well as the Deck Tan Elfic Flesh mix, just to tidy things up here and there before laying down the brush finally on the flesh work. Moving on to the bases, I started off with a couple of thin coats of Deck Tan over the sandbags. The off-green grey paint is great foundation for them to build off rather than just going straight from the primer to the sandy yellows. Using 2 thin coats Surcoat Silver, thinned 50-50 with water, I carefully painted up the corrugated steel at the lip of the trench. The first base drying, I moved to the oil drum on the second, using scale 75 forest green thinned 60-40 paint to water as a base in a couple of thinned coats. I wanted to have a darker green so as not to contrast too much with the mini, but still feel like it belonged. With the Deck Tan dried, I started to build up the sandbags with some 2 thin coats of Vampire Fang. Again applied thinly and a couple of 50-50 paint to water thin coats to build up a solid colour. Finally, before weathering, I used some Sistel BL Tan green shade to add some depth to the oil drum. Using some Absalon 502 burnt umber, I added a dirty weathering to the sandbags and the oil drum as it pulls nicely on the sandbags, in the crevices as well as the curves and seams of the oil drum. To finish off the sandbags, I applied a light stipple of 2 thin coats Ivory Tusk, thin 75-25 paint to water over the raised areas and the folds between the sandbags to emphasise the worn look, but to also add some fading to the colorisation like they've been out for far too long. Back to the oil drum, I sponged on some of the Surcoat to create a light chipping effect, both before it and the corrugated steel got some AK Interactive rust streaks, applied in a slightly heavier oil dot filtering method, with using a clean brush and white spirits to pull the streaks down to look like the rust has accumulated and the water running down them has caught some corrosion. If you watched any of my other videos, you will know these next steps are fairly familiar, for the basing techniques on these black Grail and the new Antioch are exactly the same, but I'm changing that up in some upcoming projects, so do keep your eyes peeled. Before I started, I applied a light coat of Army Paint and matte varnish over the models. I then used AK Terrain Muddy Ground on the bases, giving them a liberal coating to build up the mud effect. Like with my other base designs, these are textured to paint, but you can use base material over the top if you wish, and for what I wanted to achieve uniformity wise is a better path, at least for these minis. Whilst it was drying, I used Greenstuff World Scale 132 barbed wire to add some more points of interest onto the basing, pressing them into what was already there and fixing them with more of the muddy ground over the top. Once the muddy ground had cured, I went over the barbed wire with some Surcoats before moving on to some AK Splatter Effects dry mud on the lower legs and the feet of the Hounds. Using Vallejo Gloss Varnish, I applied a thin coat to the sacks and cuts to give them that wet, fresh blood look, especially the sacks with those purples and reds, and the technical have a lot of depth to them, and the gloss varnish allows all those various shades to come through. To grime up the barbed wire, I used some Sistel Contrast Rust and Grime to take the shine off and add some depth to the wire. When applying the muddy ground, I stuck in a broken coffee stirrer to make a makeshift broken plank to add some interest to the base. Using scale 75 brown leather to base and then scale 75 walnut to highlight, I was able to make the plank look more realistic and worn, so that again, although being a point of interest, it wouldn't detract from the model as a whole. Turning my attention back to the barbed wire, I added a light dry brush of the Surcoats just to pick out the barbs. Going back to the sandbags, I added some AK Splatter Effects wet mud to them just to break up the colours and shapes, as well as added some realism for the weather. I started the effect on the heralds with some fetid water and continued that on the Hounds by first applying some AK Diorama Water Gel Swamp Green and then was halfway through curing some AK puddles mixed in the top layer. The final weathering touch was the Dirty Down Gore. This wonderfully disgusting glue-like substance is applied to the barbed wire on the base, the sacks, the cuts and saws on the Hounds themselves, and to add that final layer of vinous before finishing off with a nice coat of Sistel Abaddon Black around the base rims. Mistakes were made along the way, but overall I'm really happy how these Grail Hounds came out. They were tricky to get right, but I hope you like the final outcome as much as I do. As always, thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to do all the usual things like, comment, share, subscribe and follow, and I'll see you in the trenches.